In the summer of 1941, Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet his good friend Franklin Delano Roosevelt. From these two men, who so well understood the moral force of ideals, emerged the Atlantic Charter. This document blueprinted for all the world the fundamental freedoms to which the two great English-speaking nations pledged themselves as their goal in war and peace.
80 years after Roosevelt and Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson today will sign a 21st century version of that historic accord. Joe.
Yeah, and Willie, you know, it's so interesting. Over the past 4.5 years, past 5 years, we've been talking about that Atlantic Charter. We've been talking about NATO. We've been talking about how it's been fraying at the edges. And some among us, I'm not naming anybody, Willie, have suggested that perhaps America will never survive, that our relationships will be forever frayed because of the 45th president of the United States. And who knows, maybe that's true. I suspect it's not. But it is interesting. We certainly got to see Donald Trump's view of the world, which was unique for any post-war president. Now we're going to get to see Joe Biden's follow-up to see if there is damage with this relationship and how he can clean it up.
Yeah, first of all, I wish John Meacham were here talking about the Atlantic Charter, his book, Franklin and Winston, about their friendship. That was signed before America even got into World War II, actually, a few months before Pearl Harbor. So such an interesting dynamic between those two guys. And, of course, the two countries, and President Biden has explicitly said, yes, this trip is about repairing some of that damage. This trip is about the President of the United States going back into the world, particularly to our strongest allies, and saying, we are here for you. We don't view our relationship as some kind of a financial transaction. And it really starts today when Joe Biden meets with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Cornwall ahead of the start of the G7 summit tomorrow. The two leaders expected to stress close ties and try to manage their personal and political differences. Yesterday, President Biden had this to say about America's standing in the world.
We're going to make it clear that the United States is back and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future. I believe we're at an inflection point in world history, the moment where it falls to us to prove that democracies will not just endure, but they will excel as we rise to seize the enormous opportunities of a new age. We have to discredit those who believe that the age of democracy is over, as some of our fellow nations believe. We have to expose as false the narrative that decrees of dictators can match the speed and scale of the 21st challenges. You know, and I know, they're wrong. But it doesn't mean we don't have to work harder than ever to prove that democracy can still deliver for our people.
Let's bring in NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley. He's on the ground with President Biden in Europe, and he joins us live in Cornwall. Matt, set the scene for us.
Yeah, Mika. Well, I mean, we're talking about Joe Biden, who's going to be starting a week of really interesting, somewhat tense meetings. Now, of course, the anchor of this trip, the main event, is going to be next week in Geneva, and that's when the president meets with Vladimir Putin. That is going to be a pivotal exchange. But really, that meeting is going to be hanging over all the meetings that are going to be happening here in Cornwall with the G7, with some of the observer countries who have come to witness the G7 discussions. And also, crucially, as you mentioned, with Boris Johnson today. Now, this meeting with Boris Johnson, you guys were talking about the Atlantic Charter from 80 years ago, this year, 1941. One of the really important things about the Atlantic Charter is that it set the groundwork for what would later become NATO and the United Nations. And that's one of the main messages that Joe Biden is bringing here to Cornwall, is that these international institutions that have formed the groundwork, the plumbing underneath all of the international relations, the major, modern international relations that we see post-war, that those need to be renewed. And that's what he's bringing here. You know, Boris Johnson, his office at number 10 Downing Street, they really deliberately try to stylize Boris Johnson as a kind of latter-day Winston Churchill. So this, posturing with this Atlantic Charter, this might be lost on the States, but here in Britain, that's a really big deal for Boris Johnson to be able to show that he is with America, that they're plowing ahead, and that they're moving independently of Europe. Because remember, Boris Johnson was the main champion of Brexit, something that Biden and Barack Obama were very critical of. Guys?
NBC's Matt Bradley, thank you very, very much. Let's bring in White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire, who is traveling with the president, and BBC News anchor and correspondent Katty Kay joins us. And Joe, one of the things this White House behind the scenes has told me they're trying to do is show, not tell. And what you see happening, we'll be reporting more on the COVID vaccines that the U.S. will be delivering to the world, but also on this trip to show, not tell people what our place in the world is.
Right, and a return to normalcy. By the way, Katty, feel free if you'd like to, like a sidebar on Boris Johnson wanting to be seen as a latter-day Winston Churchill. You feel free to comment about that. I'm curious, though, about the relationship with Boris Johnson. The one thing that he has been actually effective in doing is having a good relationship with Donald Trump, the last president, being a champion of Brexit and lining up with Donald Trump with sort of this latter-day conservative populism, that this sort of new populism that many on the right across the world are embracing. But he also moved very quickly in congratulating Joe Biden, moved very quickly in showing that his relationship was with the country and not with the man, more so, I must say, than other world leaders. How is his relationship with Joe Biden?
Well, first of all, Boris Johnson's relationship with history, and you're right, there is nothing more that he would like than to be compared in any way to Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister who wrote the biography of Winston Churchill would love to hear those words. There's clearly some political friction between the two. Joe Biden had called Boris Johnson a clone of Donald Trump. At one point, Boris Johnson had suggested that Donald Trump was deserving of the Nobel Peace Prize. So there is a bit of history. They're not necessarily politically aligned either. Joe Biden very committed to multilateral relationships. We're going to see a lot of that during this trip. And of course, Boris Johnson pulled Britain out of that big multilateral relationship in the European Union. But all of the senior diplomats on the British side that I speak to say these are professionals in the White House. They are not going to let the past get in the way of what can be a very solid future relationship. And there are some areas in which actually Boris Johnson has a much closer political tie with Joe Biden than he did with Donald Trump. Areas like climate change. Boris Johnson is actually spending a lot of time on and is very committed to the issue of climate change, something that he finds in this White House much more than he did in the Trump administration that he can have an affinity with. International development issues, also something that Boris Johnson wants to look at. Vaccine distribution, also something Boris Johnson wants to look at. And again, he's got a much better partner in Joe Biden in that than he would have done in Donald Trump. So there are plenty of areas where they can work together. And if Joe Biden is happy in any way to suggest that Boris Johnson has echoes of Churchill about him, he's going to get a very warm reception there in Cornwall.
Yeah, trying to lead Joe Biden perhaps to that comparison in their meeting today. Jonathan Lemire, it's interesting, there are real issues on the docket today when the two leaders meet. They'll talk about Northern Ireland, they'll talk about climate, they'll talk about trade. But really, as you write in your piece for the Associated Press this morning, this is about Joe Biden saying out loud that America is back, the United States is back as a partner to its allies.
That's right, Willie. And there's certainly some deliverables, as the White House likes to call them, that they will be announcing on this trip. The 500 million vaccine doses for the world, which is a big deal. The U.S. partnering with send Pfizer vaccines across the globe. Yes, there will be some discussion of Northern Ireland. President Biden is, keenly interested in that scenario. He's proud of his Irish heritage. Worrisome there about that border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. Now that, of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU. How that could perhaps impact the peace process. But this is more about symbolism. It's about messaging. It's about the White House and this president suggesting that, look, the last 4 years were the blip. That was the aberration. We're back to a sense of predictable, normal U.S. relations. Now, he's going to have to do some convincing of that. The rest of Europe is not necessarily certain. They worry about what could come 4 years from now. A return to Trumpism, if not Trump himself, but someone like him. They fear that maybe Biden is the blip in this. But Biden is trying to say to these leaders, and he'll start with meeting Prime Minister Johnson today, obviously the rest of the G7 tomorrow, and then we go from there. That America can be relied upon again. And he's trying to show sort of a unified front against certainly Russian aggression, with Putin being the capstone of this trip in about a week's time, but also against China economically. And he's going to have to do some convincing there. Some of the other nations don't quite have the same black and white view of both Russia and China as President Biden does. But it's about warmth, it's about friendship, it's about